the, the ownership of the choice and the decision, I think is super helpful. We still have people who really are desperate for the clarity of like, well, how many actual days do I have to be here? And which are those days? And, it's funny because when people have to own their own decisions, sometimes it's a lot harder than if somebody can tell you what to do. And I think that that's in many areas of their lives. And then I also think that, from a space planning and, lifestyle benefits and all those kinds of things, it's kind of hard on the company. We're still navigating that out. How many desks, how many chairs, how many people do we, I feel very strongly that if you're going to require people to come into an office, they should have their own space. They should have their own desks. So it shouldn't just be this random hoteling, and we've committed to doing that. But that's, that's an expensive choice depending on what company you are and where you're at and those types of things. And then I also think culturally, what does it mean? How do you make sure that the time that people are coming into the office feels valuable versus just like, am I just getting in my car in this torrential rainpour because I have to? And then there are some jobs that people do have to come into the workforce. I think we're, in sort of technology or any of the sort of computer-driven software types of jobs, like we sort of forget that there are people who have to show up every day, not just in our industry. I mean, like our workplace services team has to show up to keep those offices up and running. We realize that for things like fraud, it's actually easier to have people in a room together and sort of talking about what the issues are and how to solve those things. And so, how do you make that clear to people so that they understand that it isn't, like this isn't just everybody is doing it type of thing. And we all feel the same way where if people work in hospitals or in labs or those other places, I feel sometimes like we have to give context that not everybody gets to work from home all the time, and that is not the sort of norm, but it's hard. I mean, I think, in recruiting, we see a handful, a small percentage of people are like, no, I only want to do remote. I think the media makes it into a way bigger story, which actually does make it challenging. I also think there's a bit of a pendulum on that right now too, where there was, I think, before people actually started coming back to the office, this huge, like, I only want to be remote forever, and what we're seeing now is people who are much more open, and it could be economically, it could just be as they put their toes in the water. And different regions are very different about this, right? Like, we've got a very large number of employees in California, which, took a very different approach to COVID and the regulations and the requirements, both on the state level, local levels. And then we have a large office in London, which has a different set, and then, Canada, and then also here in Charlotte. Everybody had a different perception, everybody was experiencing it different. And how do you keep that sort of structure so that people felt like they were heard, but also you were very, very clear on the why and what's going to happen. So, I think flexible is really working for us. And, everybody has been back into the office. So I don't believe in babysitting employees, but I also think, we were looking at the data. Like, what was it telling us? How many people, when were they coming in? Who was coming in? And then obviously people who had certain health issues or those kinds of things, we had a process for that. But what we're finding is people actually, and I think even it's like any of us who chose to show up here today, like missed being around other people, and there's value. And I personally feel very strongly too, if you are a junior in your career, there is a lot to be said for just being around other people and absorbing what you're learning. And so, our interns are all here in Charlotte this summer. They're super excited to be in person. And then our new grads as well are all, sort of embracing that. And we're not seeing anything in recruiting, which I think is generally what people go to, like everybody's gonna quit. We're not seeing it that. And we're also not seeing it in terms of making it hard to hire. So I think if you're just clear on the why and the how, I think at least, people can make those choices for themselves.
Sure. And as far as getting the work done, when you have so many factors here, you're leaving autonomy to the local departments, how do you make sure everything gets done? You keep up with everything, you maintain a structure. Has that been challenging at all?
I don't think so. I think we already wanted to give a lot of that. We're structured in verticals, and so people, each business sort of has their own general manager. People were clear on who their managers are and what to sort of, I think again, going back to that context piece of like, how do you make decisions? So we haven't had an issue. I mean, in general, like if you hire adults and you set the culture and you're clear on the expectations for them, you shouldn't have to really worry about that. And if they're not meeting expectations, then you should have that conversation with them. Right. I don't think you should, and this is, I think, a very, I've worked on the technology side for 25 years, and so I sort of have this very strong belief system of like, really, at the end of the day, people are choosing to show up. We talk a lot about that. That's your choice. You can be here or not be here. You get to choose if you want to work on this work. If you don't want to be here, that's okay too. The talent market's been amazing for, especially in that industry, for my entire career. And then I also think you should just expect people to, deliver and not assume that they won't. Like people, I think we see a lot of times companies that, you go to such an extreme where you feel like you have to have a rule for everything or everything's written down. And then what happens is your employees then don't feel like they have any accountability for anything because, right. Well, it's just already been told to me. Right. And then I think on the other side of that too, like if you have too many rules, no one can remember what the ones that are that important, which is kind of my thing, where it's just like, why don't we tell people what the kind of couple of things that they should right. really care? Security is a big deal for us. Privacy is a big deal for us. Be smart around these things. Keep yourself, pay attention, focus on that. Let's not worry about kind of all the rest of the stuff.
Sure, makes sense. You mentioned this a couple of times, and I want to delve in just a little bit more. The idea of company culture. Yeah. This was, of course, very important to Credit Karma pre-pandemic, even more so now. How did you maintain that in 2020, but also now, hopefully, we'll say post-pandemic? Maybe I spoke too soon.
That might be, yeah, I think there's definitely a pre-2020 and then a post-2020 for every company. I don't think that's just Credit Karma in particular. I think that's everybody. Our 2020 just happened to be a much rockier road than a lot of people had seen, and so I think there are some, fundamentals that we learned from that. Culture is really about, in my opinion, how decisions are made, how they're communicated, and how you live that every day. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it is, and we're a year and a half post-acquisition. Our entire management team is still at Credit Karma, which I think was kind of pretty impressive from that perspective. It's a group of people that now have worked together for a really long time and are really passionate about why they're there. And our culture is much more about, are we doing the right thing for our member? Are we, taking the right risks in the sense of, we really have worked hard to encourage the idea that things are going to fail, like you got to take a lot of shots on goal to get the ball to go into the goal. Sorry to use a sports metaphor for those of you who aren't sports people, but that's the way things work, which is, and not everything is going to be successful, and that's okay. And we've continued on the, comfort with letting people ask questions and hard questions, and we haven't backed away from that. I'm not a big fan of anonymous. I feel like if we're going to be transparent with our employees, we should ask that back from them. So, and we don't, we find people who are really good about asking very hard questions in big company meetings or on our Slack channels. And because we don't shy away from them, if something doesn't get answered directly in a meeting, we will follow right back up on Slack, and everybody gets to hear the message, or we'll send an email if there's something that it does require a lot more context or something like that. And then I think the other piece is, asking your employees to hold you accountable. And the leader isn't necessarily the manager. The leader is the person who shows up and makes the decisions, and then is accountable for how those decisions were actually made. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, you were talking, of course, now Credit Karma is hiring like crazy. It looks very different from 2020. So how are you going about recruiting employees? As fintech industry is very competitive these days, as you noted.
Yeah.
How do you set yourself apart? And going along with that, how do you keep people with Credit Karma?
Right. So I think those two things are very aligned, and in fact, one of the reasons why, if you look at my weird, crazy title, we call it C3PO. So there's a lot of photos of like C3PO around in our group. The publicity piece is really around our comms team, our PR, social media, And one of the things I think is really important is that your inside narrative needs to match your outside narrative. So how people are treated, how they feel, what you're doing inside really has to matter what you're telling the outside world in terms of your product and how you treat your we call them members or customers, those kinds of things. And so we sort of bridge those two things together around those experiences. And I think that has helped with both narratives on each side. But internally, we actually have the lowest attrition we've had in our company's history over the last year. It's kind of been, I actually even was a little surprised, just given everything going on in the world, and people had a lot of liquidity and those kinds of things. So, so I'm really proud of that fact. So we haven't had a hard time holding on to people, and our recruiting acceptance rate is the highest it's ever been. So we're sort of in this weird bubble of happiness that could, I can't ever predict how that's going to go, but it feels really nice right now. But I think there are a couple of reasons why. Number one, we are very clear with people about who we are and who we are not. So to the point on remote work or not remote work, we're very clear about that. We're very clear about the vaccine thing. Like we sort of make decisions, we stick with them, we sort of move forward. And we're very clear with people about this is what our mission, this is what it means, those types of things. And then we also really work to provide certainty in a number of ways. And so I actually talked about this, I think the last time I was at this conference, where we have a very unique pay structure that people, for the most part at our company, really love. And I think when we talk about it externally, it's surprising that people like it, where we do role-based pay. So everybody who is in the same role, by geography, we do geographically adjust compensation, gets paid the exact same thing. And we don't do bonuses except for at the top of the company. And the reason we do that is only because it's tied to the company goals, and we believe that the senior management should be tied to their pay should be at risk relative to sort of company and shareholder performance. But everybody else, we don't do bonuses, we don't do merit increases, like this person gets $3,000 over here and this person gets $2,000 more in salary. It's the exact same thing. So if you're a software engineer 2, everybody around here who's also a software engineer 2 makes the exact same amount, and then just localized for if you're in Charlotte or San Francisco or LA or something like that. We do run a promotion cycle 4 times a year. So it's a fully calibrated promotion cycle where the promotion committee who looks at sort of all of the candidates, and what we did is we spent all that time you normally spend on all this BS to do performance reviews or bonuses or all that kind of crap. We basically put that time on the front end to build out really great job architecture and frameworks so people could understand what the expectations are for their roles and what it would take to get promoted. We're very clear it's not a checklist, but in general, if you were to I did download all of them when we were in the process of being acquired by Intuit, and it's like 90 pages of stuff to look at all of them for each role, but we give very extreme clarity on what is expected for each job. So when we go into those promotion cycles, it's a lot easier. So now we don't spend time on performance reviews or those kinds of things. And then twice a year, we do a market review. So every February, every August, we actually, we use Radford for anybody who's nerdy in compensation. And we sort of look at all of the jobs where everybody is at. If the pay has moved for that job, your pay moves with it. If the pay hasn't moved, we haven't ever taken anybody down. We do change people's pay if they move jobs. So like when we did that whole, you're moving out of recruiting and now you're moving into being a product manager, your pay moved to whatever that job was. If you moved into member support, your pay moved to that. I mean, it was really, because that's the only way we have this very extreme pay equity. But that has worked really well for us. So in our annual survey, there's usually a question that's like, do I believe in my total compensation is fair, or something like that. We generally score between 88 and 90% of people believing that their pay is fair. And I think people really appreciate the certainty of that pay, versus your at-risk pay, which you never know how that bonus is going to go. I think, and the reason we had done this was really, personally, and there's a lot of research now. It's hard for managers, I think, to make some of those calls, and they're not, as much as they kind of know this person's doing well versus this person isn't doing as well, they're not always great at determining what does that mean, and tying that to the work that people do felt very arbitrary in a number of ways. It's also very hard to catch people up over time. So, I think our data around retention, obviously, and then recruiting kind of leads you down that path to believe that, people feel taken care of and valued in that way. So, it's worked for us. I know it's not for everybody. Usually the first question I get from people is like, how do you believe that you have a merit-based system, or how do you reward top performers, or blah, 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 blah. And I'm gonna first of all say, like, that whole, like, $5,000 more in pay that you gave to one person versus the other, isn't gonna change anybody's behavior the next year. I also don't think that, like, big, huge bonus is probably gonna really change somebody's behavior in the long term, other than to potentially walk out the door and ask for that bonus somewhere else. So, I just, after all these years, haven't seen that. But I know it is very different. It takes a while. We also, we do guarantee equity. So every year on we call your Karmaversary, so your service date, everybody gets an annual grant for that, every role. And you get a new hire grant. And then we do have a program, one discretionary related program. It's called the Exceptional Impact Program. It's once a year. It's a tops down, bottoms up, so you can nominate yourself, you nominate your peers, you nominate anybody you want, and we use the word impact in particular, so it's not just about quote unquote performance, but like what did you do that impacted our members or our customers, and that's a stock-based, an additional stock grant that you can get through that program that the leadership does decide, but that also works in everybody's favor, because if you have sort of great people adding value and doing high impact, and everybody has stock, so everybody's sort of a winner. Everybody wins when the value is going up.
Right. And so I'm sure your employees missed all of the performance reviews. I'm sure they missed that a lot, right?
Heartbroken.
Yes, that's my favorite part, right?
Yeah.
Well, what does hiring look like now at Credit Karma? I think you said 1 in 3 have been there less than a year.
Yeah, so we've we're smaller. We are not one of the big, huge companies. I think in fintech, that's still sort of burgeoning in so many ways. And I love the phrasing of InsurTech. I worked at a company called Climate Corp years ago, which actually was acquired by Monsanto, but we made technology for farmers, and we also had a insurance product for weather. But it was a really interesting business to be a part of. But so we had about 500 people last year, and in Charlotte in particular, we've added 550 people since January of 2021. So we went from 50 people to 600. That is a whole new place down, for any of you who are local, down in Ballantyne. We built out a brand new office, and we have a very aggressive hiring plan for next year. As well. And so we'll sort of keep at it, and hopefully those people who will have been here a year will now be the ones who are sort of indoctrinating and bringing everybody else up of the new group that's coming in.
Sure, yeah. And for those of you that don't know, Credit Karma just opened a brand new office down in Ballantyne. Plenty of expanded space to fit these people.
Yes.
So they are ready for the growth, for
right,
sure.
Right. We actually are out of desks at the moment. I'm sure all of us have gone through these supply chain shortages, so evidently drywall is still a problem, and chairs. So we're working through that.
There you go.
Good problem to have. I always like to say, like, the best problems, and this is, back to the 2020 note, and as things are a little rocky potentially, as we look at all the economic indicators right now, and it's really hard to predict the future. I think framing for your employees what they should expect and what could happen, and building that narrative. So I always say, like, it's better to be adding chairs to the deck than taking chairs off. Like, you want to, all the pain that you go through when something is new or you're growing or that's hard, those are all the pains that you want versus the pains of, like, having to take chairs away or not hiring or not backfilling or having to do pay cuts or sort of horribly lay people off or those kinds of things. So, I try to continue to remind people of that, of, like, as hard as this is, these are the right problems to have, not the wrong ones.
Right, good point. Well, just want to hear your perspective here. What do you think the future of work and working in an office will look like in the next, say, 5 years, maybe 10 years, if you're feeling imaginative?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's such a polarizing conversation. Like, I don't know about anybody else, but you read on LinkedIn and these people have like dug in on each side. And I really think it depends on who your company is, how you want to bring people together, not bring people together, how you want them to communicate. Like, I think it's a pretty open playing field, and the more choices people have, the better they can make those choices that work for them. And I think people will change throughout their lives too, of sort of what works well, what doesn't work well. I will say one of the things I am most concerned about right now is, 2 years for many people behind a screen, or people who have never been in the work environment. The relationship skills, I call like basic second grade playground, frankly. So like, when if you've had kids, or remember, you've got a couple of kids who are kind of sort of arguing on the playground, and when one of them runs to the teacher to like go solve the problem for them, and what normally the teacher says is like, no, you need to go back and talk to that person and work it out. That work it out skill has really atrophied over the last couple of years. And you turn your camera off, I'm just not gonna deal, I don't have to see this person.
Right.
I do think that is something we're working a lot on. We've got some manager trainings on it and a lot of individual classes right now on just sort of kind of restarting those communication engines in different ways. And I think those types of experiences more and more, I do think, in general, if we could change, I don't have control of this, but if we certainly could change some of the tax policies and making it easier for people to move state to state and do those kinds of things, I do think you're going to see more and more of this flexibility going on. I think it is sort of the root, but then it's the somehow, some way that you come together will continue to be important. And whether that is an every week experience or it is a once a month experience or whatever your culture defines, I do think that is sort of the wave of the future. I think we're not necessarily going back to the 5 days a week every single, and I just use my 10 vacation days or whatever to get out. Like, I think you're going to see a lot more portability. But there's a lot of regulatory, especially in fintech and in insurtech, that is going to also have to change in terms of like letting people work remotely with certain data, and how do you focus on the security around that and those kinds of things. So, I don't think it's as easy as employers deciding to do something. There's a lot of other sort of infrastructure. Your payroll is tied to your zip code still in a lot of cases. Your benefits are tied to your zip code. Your leave programs, those kinds of things. So. It's kind of an amusing sort of sentiment of like, I wish I could just wave my magic wand and this happens, but there are a lot of other things. And I think if you're a startup, you have a lot of considerations around what is your culture, who are those people, how do they operate together. I think you're seeing, there's a great article over the weekend about how a lot of VCs right now are only funding companies that are in person instead of remote. Especially if you're in a seed or a Series A, because of the sort of the beliefs that whether that's true or not is up to each company. And then I think as you get bigger, there probably is an advantage to provide clarity on what those expectations are, and people just get better at sort of managing their time and their work as they progress through their career.
Right. Well, we have just a few minutes left here, but I wanted to take the opportunity to open it up to any audience questions. So if there's anything anyone would like to ask Colleen, here she is. I will try to see you all if you raise your hand.
It's the shy crowd.
Nobody?
Oh, wow.
Oh, we got one right here.
Who's got a mic?
He's got a mic. And if you please introduce yourself.
Oh yeah, no anonymous, got to introduce yourself.
Right. She doesn't like anonymous.
Dan Commissar. Hey, Colleen.
Hi.
Great talk. Curious how all of what you described has changed since the merger. Has Big Co affected all the sort of cultural nuances you're describing?
Yeah, this has been something, so I referenced earlier, I had been through an acquisition. I had been at this startup called the Climate Corp, and we'd been acquired by Monsanto, and they had said, oh, you're gonna stay independent, you're gonna do your own thing, you're gonna be fine, and like within 6 months, like all of that was fading very quickly, and then I exited, left. And I have to give it to Intuit that I think it pains them at times, very, very much so, but we do operate independently only to the extent of anything that's like a public company requirement. So there are, some all Intuit related sort of trainings around your stock or things like that we obviously fall into the windows of. And our finance team still reports and gets paid through Credit Karma, but sort of is dotted line into their chief accounting officer for all intents and purposes. But really, I think because we've been successful, we've continued to deliver. I've always said profitability gives you freedom. It's like it's great to learn in startup land. It's even better in big company land. So they've held true to their word. Now, I will say, I think their CEO, Sasan, was very committed to this. He is still committed to this. Everybody knows if you've been through an acquisition, like it's 50-50 at best anyway to start with. And then it's very hard for the big company to not just either make assumptions that they're better, which is probably not why you acquired that company, or it has to be done this way because we are bigger. And he's one of the best at sort of clearing the runway. And I think his staff is pretty committed. But it's hard because all through the organization, when people reach out or they want to reach out, you can't find each other. We're not like in an address book together. We're not on the same Slack. We're not in email. We're not in anything. They have a quarterly company meeting that we're optional if we want to attend, but half the time it doesn't make any sense. So we're like, I don't know what they're talking about over there. I try to tell our CEO that on the upfront, and he's a very relationship-driven guy. He's like, oh, we should just invite everybody to be fine. And then when all the questions come in where we're like, we don't actually know the answers because we're not over at Intuit. I don't know what to do with that. We're like, oh, maybe this isn't helpful. But it helped that one of the board members of Intuit, Jeff Weiner, had been the CEO of LinkedIn when LinkedIn and Microsoft did the acquisition. So they actually had a roadmap on how to do that from Jeff's perspective, and it was very much structured like that. And forever ago in my career, I had worked at Microsoft, and it just worked out that their M&A person was someone I still knew. And I reached out to her as well to say, like, hey, from your vantage point, so I could try and have empathy for this other side, like what worked out, what didn't work out. But I also will say that we, having been through an acquisition before, is super helpful when you're in the middle of the deal process, because we had a lot of things written down in that deal that gave us these guarantees on a lot of things for a certain period of time. And the harder part actually was in that zone where we had signed the deal, but we didn't have DOJ approval, so antitrust approval. So we had 10 months of this weird operating covenants that you have to actually get permission from each time. It was actually very challenging. If we wanted to do the pay cuts, we had to go, and it had to go to like 7 lawyers every single time. And we had written down in the deal, like if we were going to reference Intuit in any email, they had to see the email before we could send it. But we had Slack as a carve out, and we pretty much only use Slack anyway. So that was like a little loophole that we had. So I could give 2 extra holidays without having to ask Intuit for permission. I could just do whatever I wanted over on my side. And then, so that was way harder than it's been the last year and a half with them. So, I give them a lot of credit for that. But like I said, I think if you're in that situation, it's really about the clarity on the upfront. Do you have a stakeholder on the other side who truly is sort of committed? And then I think the third thing is if you just execute according to plan, people don't come sniffing around quite as much if you're missing, then you have bigger problems.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we are out of time now, but Colleen, I just want to again say thank you for joining us this morning. This was a great conversation. And for you all, thank you as well for joining us. I think next up we will have a session called Hello Financial Advisory, Meet the Metaverse. Yeah. So if you all would like to stick around for that, I think we'll have a couple minutes of transition time.
Thank you
all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, take care.